Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, remembering and reminiscing about classic rock radio and wondering if it does have a future. So, what got me thinking about this, I still have my Boston record on the shelf here. I just made a video on this album. It should be up already. And as I mentioned in this video, every song on this record is just a classic rock radio staple. You hear every song here on the radio. And it got me thinking back about how what part radio played in my early years. And it also got me thinking when I was talking about Led Zeppelin 4 too, because that's another album that got played, still gets played on classic rock radio, and it made me remember of how important radio was to my early years. So, okay, I've mentioned that I started listening to music really like the late 70s. I got into Kiss, and then 1980 when I heard Back in Black was really when I was all in. And back then, before the internet, 1980, 1979, the only way you were really going to hear things was if, this is even before MTV, so you were either had a friend or an older brother or sister that had records, or you heard it on the radio. And also back then, this was before the era when all the radio stations got bought up by, I forget what the name of, there's like a couple of, Clear Channel, I think is one of them, where they just went and bought all the radio stations up. So now, if you listen to a classic rock radio station in Tampa, where I live, or you listen in Pennsylvania, where I used to live, if you do that now, you're going to hear the same things. It's going to sound the same. But back then, when I first started listening to the radio, the late 70s, early 80s, radio stations were sort of independent, and because of that, they had every radio station had their own unique flavor to it, and it sort of reflected the area that you were in. Like, I grew up in a very rural, small town in Pennsylvania. And our classic rock radio station was from a town about 45 minutes away, Rock 107 in Scranton. Shout out to Scranton. And that radio station was really different than the radio station when I would visit my grandparents in Allentown, which was about an hour north of hour south, of where I used to live. And I remember I would go there and I would like listening to the radio because they would play songs in their radio station that I wouldn't hear back in my town. You know, I remember hearing "Turn Up the Night" by Black Sabbath when Mob Rules had just come out, and I was like floored that I was hearing that on the radio. And so there was a lot more uniqueness and individuality to the local radio stations. And the local radio stations were really like a big part of your community. They would do events, like if there was a store opening or something. I don't know, they still sort of do those things. But back then it was a much bigger deal. They would be there at store openings. They would be there for, they would have like, I remember somebody in my neighborhood won like a barbecue or something. The local, it was an AM radio station. They won some contest, and a local radio station showed up and made 20 hot dogs for them and brought soda or something. But this was like a really big deal because a lot of these, just like the classic rock station in my town, it had a real cool vibe to it. There was like AM radio was kind of like what my parents listened to, but this Rock 107, it was at the end of the dial, and they played hard rock stuff there. That's where you heard AC/DC and Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and stuff like that. And the DJs were also personalities, and that was something, I remember if they were doing something in town somewhere, being able to see these DJs was like, wow. I mean, these guys were like rock stars in a lot of ways. They were celebrities and personalities, and each one of them had sort of their own personality, their own. They had their own type of show that maybe they played. Like I remember later at night, they'd play more stuff like Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, really more hard rock, sort of heavy metalish type of stuff. But it was just, it was really great, and it was a lot more spontaneous. The DJs would talk between songs, and it was just had a much more unpredictable feeling to it. Whereas now, when you turn on classic rock radio, it's just like, man, oh man, you just hear the same songs over and over. The DJs, I mean, there's like these morning DJs and stuff like that, and that, I guess those are more the personalities, but it was just different back then. And so I have very fond memories of listening to the radio and discovering classic rock. I would buy these cheap cassettes and just sit there and record Queen and Led Zeppelin. And this is, as I was buying these things on my own, I had a very limited budget, so it was difficult for me took time for me to build up my collection of cassettes and vinyl. So radio was a huge part in me hearing things, and it was something that it was a real cool part of, if somebody was having a backyard party, or I don't know, a pool party or something, they had the local classic rock Rock 107 was blasting in the background, because that's what the cool people listen to. The cool kids, and your parents listen to that other stuff, but this was for the younger kids, and it was just great. And that's how I really got exposed to all this great classic rock. And I also have very, very fond memories and very like snapshot memories in my head. I don't know if anybody out there, if you have this same thing where you can sort of picture yourself where you were when you heard certain things for the first time. And this radio station I used to listen to, Rock 107, they had a thing that they called, what the heck did they would play 3 rock blocks. They would play 3 songs from an artist, and these usually came on later at night, like 9 o'clock. And they would play like a Black Sabbath rock block, or they would play an Ozzy Osbourne rock block. And that's where I remember hearing, before I had Diary of a Madman, I heard the song Diary of a Madman, and I can picture myself in the headphones that I was listening to, because it was at night. I was supposed to be in bed, and I would sit up and listen with my headphones and tape it, and I was just like, whoa, just hearing Diary of a Madman I remember exactly where I was. And so I have these memories of like hearing stuff like this for the very first time. I'll tell you a funny story. I can't remember why this was, but our teacher at the school had to drive us somewhere. It was like me and like 3 other kids or something. I think there was like, I don't know, like a spelling bee or something, and we had to go to another school. And we somehow convinced her to please let us turn on, Rock 107, the hard rock station. And she was sort of reluctant at first to do this, and she said, okay, I'll let you listen to it on this 15-minute car ride. We turned it on, and I remember when we turned it on, they just started playing TNT by AC/DC, and it was like, yeah, this is so cool. So I could picture myself riding with my like 6th grade teacher in the car listening to TNT, and all of us in the car banging our heads, getting into it, singing along and everything. And the other and also on that radio station they used to play, is sort of a unique thing for back then. They would play live concerts, the King Biscuit Flower Hour. Who remembers the King Biscuit Flower Hour? This was like I'm guessing it was a monthly show. I don't think it was a weekly show. Maybe it was. I don't know. But it was like a syndicated radio show that would record live shows. And I remember hearing Ozzy with Randy Rhoads, the King Biscuit Flower. I recorded it onto cassette, and hearing, I can't remember who were some of the other, but I think I might have heard Judas Priest on the King Biscuit and just a whole bunch of other bands. And it would come on kind of late, like Saturday night at 10 o'clock or something something like that. So that sort of added to the coolness of it all, that it was something you kind of had to stay up late to hear. And my other memory of radio is where I grew up. There was a lot of college radio stations, and there was 3 of them that I used to be able to get. And the one in particular was Selinsgrove Radio, WQSU, I believe, are the call letters. I can't believe that I remember that. I think that's right. Anybody from Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania out there? And I used to just, this station was a little tough to get in, and I used to have like an antenna that was like this really long, it was like a flexible thing, but it was like, looked like almost like a speaker wire sort of. It had a shielding around it and everything. So I could stretch this thing around, and I had it all worked out that it was like, the thing was probably like 8 feet long or something ridiculous like that. If I wrapped it here and held it up here and put it over this thing and dangled it a certain way, I could get this radio station. And this station, for anybody out there who might not be familiar with college rock radio back then used to just be, and probably it still is to this day, it's really just kind of wide open programming. And so you could hear anything, and at this night, and it was all like stuff you wouldn't hear on mainstream radio. So at night, from like 8 o'clock till midnight, it seemed like it was every night of the week. It probably wasn't, but it seemed like it was. They played metal, and this is where I heard for the first time Saxon and Accept. And the more like extreme, the more bands that you weren't hearing on regular rock radio. I heard Yngwie Malmsteen for the first time on there, and the DJs were all college kids, and of course they seemed like, when you're in 6th grade, somebody in college seems like they're just so much older than you, and they're just living in a completely different world. And they would talk about going to concerts and stuff like that, and I was just so enthralled by this, because they would sit between songs and talk about the albums and talk about concerts that they went to. And I remember one particular funny story. These 2 DJs on this college radio station were, for weeks leading up to this, they were talking about how they were going to have a chance to interview Ace Frehley. Ace was doing a solo thing at that time, and every night they were talking, okay, 2 weeks we're going to get to interview Ace. So I remember coming back, they're supposed to interview him, and coming back the next night, I listened to the show, waiting for them to talk about and hear this interview that they did with Ace Frehley. And they tell the story that they're told that they should go, that Ace is at his hotel room, and interview him at his hotel room. So they say they go to the hotel room, and they've got the door number, and they're knocking on the door, and nobody's answering. So they could see in the window, and they can see that he's in there laying on the bed, and the door is like almost open or something. So they just sort of push the door open, and there's Ace Frehley, passed out, out of his mind, passed out, unconscious, laying there on the bed. So these 2 DJs said they just stood there for like 15 minutes and just stared at him like, oh my gosh, it's Ace Frehley from Kiss, and he's laying there passed out on the bed. And these guys like weren't disappointed at all that they didn't get to do this interview with him. They were just so excited that they got to stand in a room with a passed out Ace Frehley for 15 minutes. So, that was the cool thing about the college radio stuff, that you could hear all this different stuff, and that's where I got exposed, and that's where I heard Metallica for the first time. Here's another funny college radio story. Again, this is for you younger kids out there. This is way before the internet. How would you know these things before the internet, right? Before MTV. This is even before MTV. And they were playing stuff from the first Metallica album, but they weren't saying, the DJs on this station weren't saying Metallica, they were saying Metalicia, So I remember walking around in school telling friends like, yeah man, you should check out this group called Metalicia. I've been listening to them on the radio. I taped a couple of their songs and they sound awesome. And eventually somebody stopped me and was like, Metalicia? Do you mean Metallica? I was like, oh, I guess. I said, are you sure? You know, the DJs, or they say Metalicia, you know, and she was, I don't know, maybe it is Metalicia. You know, this is the innocence of the time. How the heck were you supposed to know back then? So I was walking around for a good probably 6 months or a year saying Metalicia. And I still to this day in my head say that sometimes when I'm thinking of Metallica. I just say Metalicia. It's stuck with me for all these years. So I have very fond memories of being up, supposed to be in bed late at night, which was probably like 10 o'clock at that time, with my headphones on, cheap cassette tape, recording stuff from college radio, recording stuff off of the local hard rock, classic rock station. And so, you know, radio played a really big role. When I really sat down and thought about it, I was like, you know, man, radio played a really big part in my early developmental years. And just a little fun trivia thing, my wife, before I met her, she was a metal DJ at the college that I went to. So I had listened to her. They used to have a Metal Mondays show, and I used to listen, and that was actually hearing her show and everything before I even met her. So the first time that I met her, the first time that I met her, the first thing that she said to me is don't you play bass? I know, I was like, yeah, I play bass. She goes, who's your favorite bass player? My favorite bass player is Steve Harris from Iron Maiden. And I was like, whoa. And then she was like, yeah, and I have a metal show at the local college. And I was like, whoa, that's you. And so I was in love. She was beautiful. She liked heavy metal, and she knew who the bass player in Iron Maiden was. So, yeah, so I have very fond memories of radio, and it's kind of sad that, you know, I don't listen to radio anymore. Sometimes when I'm out, there's a rock station in Tampa that is not owned by Clearwater or whatever the name of those people are who own all the radio stations now. And they play a lot of 80s metal like Rat and Twisted Sister. So sometimes when I'm out, I'll listen to that, but it's just not the same. And I can't imagine that there's many young kids that are listening to radio, and with the advent of streaming and satellite radio and Sirius XM and stuff like that, I just can't imagine that FM radio, it is not what it used to be. But there was a point in time where FM radio was king, and it was really something that everybody listened to, and it was a really big part of everybody's life and in your community. It was sort of something that if you're my age, you can probably remember your local hard rock radio station when you were growing up. You know, it was really a part of your youth, a part of your town and your community. So, all right, so there you go, a little trip down memory lane with classic rock radio. What are your memories of radio? I know I have a lot of viewers out there that are the same age as me, and I do hear people talking about radio. So what are your memories of radio? What did radio play in your early years? How was it influential for you? What did it do for you for discovering bands? And then just how was it a part of your life? Let me know in the comments down below. And until we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.